broadly speaking, in response to this, the left has thought about these developments over the last few decades in one of two ways. Although I want to argue that the kind of spark I'm speaking to in terms of the Vancouver Socialist Forum and other places is an alternative way to think about these developments. I think the first way has been the argument that capitalism has fundamentally changed through the new technologies, the organizations of the firm, globalization, and so on. And it's required unions in the left to adapt to and transform their previous political projects and adapt to this new world. This, of course, is the position of third wayism and has become the dominant position of contemporary social democracy and the social democratic parties, the NDP in Canada. It's also penetrated quite clearly a lot of the civil society organizations, particularly in the NGO sector, and they've come in a way to accommodate neoliberalism rather than confront or resist it, and have become integrated in a sense into the politics of neoliberalism. A second way of looking at this is to think about the developments over the last couple of decades and think of them largely as quantitatively increasing the internationalization of capitalism and the rollbacks of workers' living standards, but in some senses that nothing is new in this. And to some extent seeing it as a continual aspect of the crisis that began to form in the 1970s. And it remains characteristic of contemporary capitalism. In this sense, that neoliberalism in contemporary period is mainly thought of in terms of a capitalist response to an economic crisis that it can't resolve. And therefore that the old thinking about the nature of capitalism or the present period, and particularly our old organizational forms, are still sufficient means to address this period. I think both of these positions either exaggerate the changes that have occurred or fail to understand many of the current contradictions, problems, and forms that capitalism has taken on. In particular, I think fails then to analyze the way we have to not only understand this phase of capitalism, but also begin to think through what are the new necessary organizational changes and developments we'll have to take on to be able to confront neoliberalism and begin again putting on an alternative to capitalism. In other words, to begin again rethinking and making possible a 21st century socialism, to take up the terms that Chavez has given us. Finally, I think we also need to think of the way that the state structures and neoliberalism has formed inside the state. It's often said in this period that neoliberalism has been anti-state and been pro-market. But I think this really misses the point, the way that the state has been transformed internally. I don't think we see any less state, but its forms of its structures have changed significantly. Particularly its distribution or redistributional forms of state activity have become relatively marginalized. But those parts of the state that deal with economic issues have formed something that we could call, loosely has been reformed into often special parts of the state. That is, they've been given increased strength. Those parts of the state that deal with the internationalization of capital, that deal with the insulation of production activities from democratic accountability, the way central banks have been reformed. Systematically then the state has been restructured to strengthen those apparatuses of the state relative to those that deal with distributional interests. They've also been strengthened in a way that's removed them relatively from parliaments. Increasingly they're exercised by executive branches of the state. And what's increasingly occurred, then they're exercised by executive branches that are often not accountable directly to the range of political representatives. In other words, there's increasingly forming state structures, particular special relationships with the capitalist classes. You can see this partly in the secret meetings that were held in the Alberta Banff, I think it was last year, with the meetings that was held in secret between major groups of the capitalist classes in the U.S. and Canada, several cabinet ministers, and state officials, right, held in secretly, mapping out more or less where the Security and Prosperity Initiative is to go. This is not untypical. There are whole branches of the state in all countries which are operating in this same fashion. The other part of this is, of course, to go alongside this, we see that all the coercive or imperialistic apparatuses of the state have also been strengthened, whether it's the military arms, the security arms, and so on. So in other words, we haven't seen less state in this period. We've seen a different state and a transformed state. I don't think in response to these developments, it's a question of alternatives, in the sense of the left does not have alternatives to respond to this. I think if we look at the amount of theoretical models that exist, conceptual thinking across a wide spectrum of political positions, there's never been more thinking about how to address this particular, how to provide alternatives or think about alternatives. I don't think it's even a question of past experiences with alternatives. Past experiences with alternatives have a range of mixed results, some of them positive at different points in time, some of them relatively negative. But when you're transforming and building a new society, one isn't going to go in one single flash to communism. It is going to be a complex movement, and we have good and bad experiences to take up. From Cuba, parts of the Soviet Union, parts of different aspects of Sweden at different times, but there's a range of experiences that show there are a range of alternatives. I also don't think it's a question of experiences of people actually struggling for alternatives right now. There are all kinds of people engaged in all kinds of non-market alternatives. And I don't think it's simply a question of a program. Or even the sentiment of most people. When we look at, as a political scientist, when we look at these kinds of surveys, the sentiments of people against capitalism and for an alternative are still very high. It's partly also even recorded in votes. The question is, again, relates, as I said at the beginning, I think it relates to rethinking and forming political capacities to undertake this project. And I think in that sense, we must kind of account for five particular things. The first thing I think we need to account for is, of course, that we're now in quite clearly a period of social democratic realignment. That is, social democracy, not just in Canada in terms of the NDP or the Parti Québécois, but internationally has realigned. It has realigned and accepted neoliberalism and has become incorporate that and is no longer posing as a redistributional alternative to neoliberalism. I think we really need to take account of that fact because it's very important to looking at the political terrain and the openings that are occurring. The second thing is, quite clearly, is that the various old left and new left politics have basically disintegrated. That's both the old left of the communist parties, the Trotskyist parties, the post-Trotskyist parties, and everything that the new left threw up basically also disintegrated in this period. In Canada, basically, there are no significant left parties left outside the NDP. At various points in time, there were important radical kernels. And basically, the legacy of the new left in an organizational form is nil now in Canada. There's this bit of ideological legacies left, but in terms of organization, it's nil. And so the terrain is completely open in a sense, and particularly wide open in a sense when we consider where social democracy is. The third thing is I think we need to account for is, of course, is something that has been very important internationally, and that is the social form process. The social form process has operated as a larger social justice fair of resistance to globalization. We have to account for the fact that this has never had much cachet in Canada. The social form process has been incredibly thin inside Canada. Many people have participated globally, but the efforts at starting this in Canada have been particularly thin. And it's not because people are against social justice here, but I think it's clearly because we threw up many years of trying these things. In the early 1980s, there were processes, particularly in Manitoba, that had quite a bit of cachet, built up probably the most prominent one in the Choices group. That doesn't exist anymore. In Toronto, we threw up a significant organization that was very important then for the general strike that occurred in Toronto and some of the general strikes across Ontario, and that was the Metro Network for Social Justice. Doesn't exist anymore. The wider social coalitional structures that occurred nationally don't exist anymore. And those that exist are largely on paper. So these things are also gone or disintegrated or never gained much traction, which again is, I think, is part of the difficulty we're at. The fourth thing, I think, is, of course, is the civil society organizations in Canada have been relatively marginalized now, and not many are acting as social forces, major social forces, a little bit in around some of the particular campaigns, but none of them are acting as big social movements, aggregating people into fighting social forces and being able to contest political power. That is, being able to impact the political balance of force. Fifth is the point I mentioned earlier, is quite clearly the capacity, what set Canada apart from the U.S. for so long, and even to some extent unions in the other parts of the advanced capitalist country, was that the Canadian labor movement was fighting. It was fighting through the 1980s in a moment of concession and was fighting in the 1990s. But now, quite clearly, this is not the case. The CAW, which was the leader of the fight against concessions, is now a union of concessions. CUPE has also been, for whatever rhetoric it has on paper, it's also been engaged in a range of concessions, particularly at the municipal level, and the difficulty of fighting P3s and a range of other structures. We also see some of the tension, and the other key militant force was CUPW in Canada, and we saw it partly by the change of leadership from Bork to Lemelin over the last little bit, which partly came over frictions over the last few contracts and represents a similar kinds of impasse there. So I think we're at particular difficulties. I think that is the political challenge that we have to see that's before us. I think there are a range in this situation, good campaigns that are occurring in a lot of areas around electricity, water, healthcare, etc. But we're going to have to find ways to make those campaigns not only particular good campaigns against such and such act of privatization, but also as ways that they're accumulating our organizational strength. And we have to find ways so that become more significant anti-neoliberal alliances in their fightbacks. That is, we're going to have to find ways to knit them together. Otherwise, they're going to keep continuing to spin. Secondly, quite clearly, people who are still redistributional social democrats, that is, believing in some form of redistribution and some form of strengthening the redistributional politics of the state, have to seriously reflect about their political relationship to third wayism and if there's any political space left there anymore. And whether they're going to hang on, as we've seen some of the problems systematically in the Labour parties in Britain, in New Zealand, in Australia, where they've hung on and continued down that track and not broken with it, and therefore rearticulated in a different way to the wider left again, rethinking what that kind of politics might be to a different left and to a left of a different kind of pluralism. Finally, the radical left has to finally get serious. And it has to get serious on rethinking its politics and attempting to organize again. And imagine the possibility and the reality of making a different society. It is time we left all the formulations of the historical communist parties, the Trotskyist and post-Trotskyist parties behind, and began rethinking what a dynamic, broad, radical left might look like. There are many developments occurring in many parts of the world. There are significant developments of moving in this direction that we can see and drawing many inspiration from many of us in Latin America, in terms of Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador. We know the cases, which are attempting to form new parties of a different kind. We also see some important developments along this line in Europe. In the De Linke in Germany, in the Greek New Party, in the left bloc in Portugal, the way that the LCR in France is rethinking, and it's finally time in Canada that we stop sitting on our hands and began rethinking a new politics and began creating new political organizations that can begin to move in that direction and be part of this process of building a 21st century socialism and not sitting on the sidelines to address the problems of neoliberalism. That is where we have to go, and that is what has to be becoming more central in all our political minds. Thank you.
The point about recognizing that the working class is much more than the industrial proletariat, I mean, I obviously completely agree. There's two things about the working class that I think are important. One is that workers have lives. They're not just workers, they have lives outside the community. And so when there's organizing in the community, it isn't about organizing with others. First of all, it's about other dimensions of these same workers' lives. I mean, workers care about what the environment's doing to their kids or the school system or healthcare. So you have to think about class in broader terms than just being a worker. And then I absolutely agree with you that the question of people who aren't in unions, even never mind just industrial unions. But I think that also raises the question not just of why are unions not doing this. It raises the question of what kind of organizational forms do we have to actually create that might be quite different. Maybe they don't need a union like traditional unions. Maybe we need kind of municipal unions that organize people in the community around their needs and actually spend a lot of time not negotiating higher wages for them, but negotiating certain social services like free transit. And maybe that's, so I think that that's the questions it raises. I think the question about time, I should have spent more time on it in my comments. I think the question of what's happening to people's time is absolutely fundamental. You cannot have a movement that can change society if people are working longer hours so they don't have time to think, read, learn, and that they're overwhelmed with daily activities because they used to, the left used to do this by exploiting their partner. And so if you can't do this, how do you actually get around this? And, we all talk about the decline in manufacturing. When you look at the output in manufacturing, it's not declining. Manufacturing is growing in terms of value added. It's just they're doing it with fewer workers because productivity is rising, and we've stopped taking that in terms of time off. So the question of time off should be one of the most important demands that a labor movement that is thinking in terms of transforming society has to take on. Not just to shift to say, let's share the jobs in solidarity, which is important, but also so we can think and participate politically. You can't participate with that. We have to be very careful about just writing off finance as speculation. And we can have a long conversation on this, but finance is incredibly important to capitalism. It's actually important to how capitalism works. Finance has been critical to actually disciplining people, to disciplining companies, and then through the companies disciplining workers. You don't do this, you won't get the capital. Disciplining governments, so it's been very important. It's crucial to how empire works. The fact that the U.S. can attract all this capital from everywhere and mobilize it from everywhere in the world has to do with why the U.S. can play the kind of role it does. Finance has been important for something that capital needs, which is always to shift things across sectors to where they're more profitable. Finance does that. When Leo Panich and I were doing our research, we interviewed the president of General Motors worldwide, and we asked them why, in the early 80s, when interest rates were raised to 18%, they didn't complain. Right? This was going to kill the auto industry in terms of people buying cars. How come you were so silent on it? And he said, because we agreed that it was necessary. It was necessary to break the back of inflation, which meant breaking working class power, and slowing down the economy, even if it hurt us in the short run, was absolutely essential. So we shouldn't think that there is a split between, finance and the big producers.